through the work in Tanzania.
Forrest.
Yeah, I'm eating my breakfast.
Okay.
We just ate lunch.
We're expecting a nor'easter.
Oh, yeah, really?
It could dump 8 to 12 inches over the weekend.
Well, rather you than me, I can tell you that.
Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry we're running a little late. Apparently, some did not get the email with the sign-in information about 9:45, so I sent it out again, and that made us a little late. McKinley is here, I think, so we're ready to go. I would like to read 2 different passages of the Bible because I think they have different but very important considerations for us. The first one is from Matthew chapter 5, and it ends with this line, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." And that has caused much anguish amongst many people because they look at their lives and they think that they are not good enough or perfect enough. Well, people have come along and said, not to worry, the word does not mean absolute flawlessness, it means maturity. Okay, that's a step in the right direction. But that isn't even yet quite right, because the passage is not about that. The passage is about treating people even-handedly, no matter what group from which they come. It's about social ethics. It's not about personal ethics. And so one misses the whole point if one gets caught up in issues of perfection and perfectionism and so forth. So it says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, that is, be even-handed. Send the rain and the sunshine on the good and the bad alike. That's the point. Don't let walls of difference separate one from other people. So it's a very specific counsel and has no discernible connection with the flawlessness or even maturity. It has all together with breaking down these walls of division that we so easily create. But the portion of it that I would like to emphasize for this morning is that God sends the rain and the sunshine on the good and the evil alike, which means that there's a certain contingency about all of this. When we think about ecology and the environment and so forth, we need to be careful not to take too much responsibility for ourselves, because there is a kind of haphazardness. There's a kind of, the lightning strikes the forest. We can't do anything about that. Sometimes there are volcanoes that erupt. We can't do anything about that. There are tsunamis that come. So the good and the bad fall, the rain and the sunshine fall on the good and the bad alike, and therefore we should not take too much responsibility for what's going on. Okay, that's one great truth. The other one, though, I think we need to keep in mind is just the opposite. And we need to keep both of these truths in mind as we move forward. This is from Galatians 6. Do not be deceived. God is not marked, for you reap whatever you sow. I'll stop there. So on the one hand, we shouldn't take too much responsibility for what happens ecologically or anywhere, any other way. But on the other hand, the opposite thing is also true, that we reap what we sow. And the air looks a lot like what we do to it, and so does the water, and so does the earth. So on the one hand, we should not take too much responsibility. On the other hand, we need to realize that what we do makes a big difference. So let's pray. Dear God, thank you for this Sabbath school. Thank you for those who have come from all over the world to be with us. Thank you for Zoom and for Facebook that make this possible. And thank you for McKinley, who's going to share with us from his person and from his professional life much that we need to know. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, many of us know McKinley Addy as a wonderful spokesperson in our groups, in our Sabbath school. Let me reach forward and get his actual title in real life. Right now, he is Vice President for Strategic Projects Portfolio. Okay, Vice President for Strategic Projects Portfolio at a corporation called Next Generation Power and Fuels. I hope I got that right. Next Generation Power and Fuels. So this is a private outfit that helps major organizations move from ecologically unfriendly to ecologically friendly practices without losing money. That's really important, without losing money. Before that, McKinley was very active in leadership in the state government of California and became acquainted with many leaders of our government and also with many leaders of private industry and business in California. So he has a firsthand acquaintance with this from the policy world, from the business world, and of course, from his own personal interests. So I've asked McKinley to take the time he needs to share with us, and we will discuss after he's had an ample opportunity to present all that he has. I've seen his PowerPoint, and you will be happy to have been here today. So thank you very much, McKinley, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave. Good morning, Sabbath School class. Before I load the presentation, I've got a few words to say. By the way, can you all hear me well?
Yes, we don't see your screen though.
Okay, let's do that. Let's see, share screen.
Yep, now I can see it.
Now you can see it, okay.
But it's not on the slideshow yet.
Yes, I'm gonna get to that in 1 minute. Oops.
Although McKinley, unless you shared your desktop, when you change to the slideshow, we're gonna lose it. We won't get it.
Okay, hold on a minute, let's see that. How about that? What do you see now?
So now what you should do is unshare and then go back to share. Well, whoa, okay, I see you choosing slideshow.
Okay, what do you see now?
That's it, right there.
Okay.
Yeah, now we got your slideshow, so you're good to go.
Okay, thank you. So I'm still puzzled about how the class moved from its carefully laid schedule to my talk today, but here we are. And I want to thank Dave and Bronwyn for the gracious offer to speak. Thanks also to class members for their positive comments and questions to my 65 miles per hour suggestion during Dr. Ford's presentation several weeks ago. Those questions and comments prompted this exploration of the fuel and emissions benefits of Adventists in the US potentially driving at 65 miles an hour. And before long, my thoughts turned into an Excel spreadsheet and some graphs, and now this presentation. This type of presentation is best made in person, and my apologies for not being visible, but hopefully we can all get together again in person when this pandemic ends. I also want to acknowledge the hospitality of several class members who have hosted me as dinner guests in their homes when in-person meetings were being held at Loma Linda. I enjoyed the fellowship. Others of you have communicated with me in the private chat. Thank you for reaching out. And of course, I've enjoyed chats with the Larsons. The talk today builds on Dr. Ford's presentation on the visible climate emissions impacts. Our discussion today will look at the emissions which are the root cause of these observed climate impacts. We will review how such emissions are measured and how personal choices and actions can influence the outcomes. The subject of climate emissions can be dry and boring. Hopefully we can make it relevant, meaningful, and interesting to inform, build understanding, and motivate a personal response. My favorite quote from the Book of Knowledge exhorts us to get understanding, and many of you in the class have heard me share that point of view before. This next slide is an acknowledgement slide, and it's from a work and analysis that informs today's discussion. It is based on 4 years of collaborative combined efforts by some of America's premier agencies, leading institutions, and businesses, as you can see. My own old agency, I don't know if you can see me move the pointer around, the California Energy Commission is responsible for the planning of energy policy in this state. In the wisdom of the legislature, they usually combine work assignments to the Energy Commission and the California Air Resources Board. The full fuel cycle analysis work, which I'll talk about later on, was one such effort. And again, as you can see here, it included collaboration with entities like Lawrence Livermore National Lab, University of California, Berkeley, Purdue University, Argonne National Lab, which developed the tool that we used in this work. It was a career privilege to lead this pioneering joint agency work to transform the energy economy of what alternatively, or I should say alternately, is sometimes the world's 6th largest economy or the 7th largest economy. The talk is broken into 5 blocks. Part 1 will be an introductory set of slides with a takeaway message. It explores the stewardship question, what will you do about it? Part 2 will present an overview of the challenge by the numbers, response and status by jurisdiction, entities, and individuals. And this part will focus on the importance of a particular individual action. Part 3 will explore the cumulative effects and the systemic impacts with a short primer on a measurement framework by a quick review of the GREET model. And you will recall from the information that Dr. Larson sent out, GREET, G-R-E-E-T, means greenhouse gases, regulated emissions in energy and transportation model. We'll get to that later on in this slide. Part 4 of our conversation will look at the cumulative effects and systemic impacts of the individual Adventist Christian's choice and action to drive at 65 miles an hour versus 70, 75, and 80 miles an hour across 5-year, 10-year, and 20-year periods. Then we'll get into some closing thoughts and get to questions with some theological and related applications or implications. So, by way of review, I'm asking you now to think back to about 3 or 4 Sabbaths. Dr. Ford gave a presentation on climate change, ecological impacts, and with possible implications for responses by the Adventist Church and Adventist Christians. The class discussed several responses. One of the suggested actions that could be taken immediately at no cost to a person taking that action or lifestyle changes is driving at 65 miles an hour on the freeway whenever safe and possible. This suggestion generated a lot of class feedback. And after some background material, these slides will show that some cumulative effects express as a possible reduction in about 190,000 to 440,000 metric tons per year, and up to nearly 9 million metric tons over 20 years. And when one considers the potential fuel savings from some of the choices to drive at 65 miles an hour, those savings expressed as 132 million to $307 million annually, and up to $6 billion cumulatively over 20 years. Last week, Dr. Larson's discussion of Linwood's position, attributing ecological burdens to Christianity, asked the question, are ecological impacts a Christian's responsibility? Framed differently, can ecological problems be solved without actions by Christians, individually or corporately? There are 4 considerations from Dr. Ford's presentation that we as a class talked about. One of them was the education of Adventist students, preparing them for this future, which we talked about and looking at areas of engineering, ecology, and sustainability. Another one was the mandate or the injunction to stop eating meat. And then, of course, the 65 mile an hour driving whenever safe and reasonable. But Dr. Ford also talked about a very important consideration, which is that we need to understand the cumulative effects and the systemic impacts from some of the choices we make and actions we take to address the challenge of climate emissions. If you don't take anything away from the talk today, here are 4 suggested messages. You can act today to lower your transportation carbon footprint as a stewardship response to the challenge of climate emissions. You can reduce ecological impacts by your action to drive 65 miles an hour whenever possible and safe. And at this point, I should say, none of this is prescriptive. The whole idea here is to share information that can inform your choices. And there is a quote from one of the members of the class that relates very closely to this. Driving at 65 miles an hour is an important stewardship response with significant co-benefits. And even though one person's driving may seem small, small actions are powerful examples. Here is a colleague's perspective that I think you'll find very interesting. Last week, I shared an article about a meeting that Secretary Kerry had at the White House with some business leaders. And his message to them was, nothing is changing. And my colleague responded to that email with these excerpts. I believe that global climate change is the biggest challenge we all face long-term. How we establish progress in dealing with GCC, despite all of the challenges, requires concerted action. Even if California were to zero carbon emissions out, we would be a drop in the bucket. Getting the majority of responsible nations to work together and share the pain is like herding cats. We do not know, just bear with me here while I close something. Okay, great. We do not know how to address long-term issues when immediate needs overwhelm. The longest living institution is probably the Roman Catholic Church, but I doubt they will lead. Now, I found that statement rather interesting. My colleague here is variously an atheist, an agnostic, and sometimes expresses very hostile opinions towards religion. But here he is referring to a religious institution as potentially a source of solution for the long-term problem of climate change. He goes on to say, since carbon contribution is based on consumption, population growth must be more than offset by reduced consumption. The more of us there are, the less there is for each. I guess the US was responsible for more like a third, but at 15%, California is only 1.5 or around 2%. And this is what's key to his comment. We can only set examples. Even if our contribution or our action in response to climate emissions is minuscule, is negligible, we can set examples. In this slide, I want to just highlight a few comments from members of the class, and then one comment from an Adventist Review reader of the article that Dr. Larson also shared in the email. Quote, and by the way, if your comment here appears and you recognize it and you feel comfortable with me identifying you, please let us know in the discussion. But I thought this was a very important comment that was shared in the chat. The recent presentations have all focused on changing attitudes and behavior. While using religious beliefs as an impetus to change behaviors can be a start, a more robust response to changing behavior is convincing or persuading the person of the intrinsic value of the behaviors instead of changing behaviors to please a wife or better still a God or vice versa. The key to that quote and that comment is that we need to look at ways to persuade or convince other people of the intrinsic value of the behaviors that we're looking to model. And that's why this look at the potential benefits and co-benefits of driving at 65 is important. Why should somebody drive at 65? When I'm on the freeway and other people are barreling past me at 70 miles per hour, 75 miles an hour, 85. Another quote that I found also very important to this conversation says, stop eating meat, drive at 65. I can live with that. Another important observation here is, which was surprising to me, but also I think encouraging, is that people actually, class members actually went out and tried to drive at 65 miles an hour. And one comment to me in the private chat was, I tried driving at 65 miles an hour this week, but found it problematic. And finally, we need to hear this message more often from our pulpits and publications. I find it sad that I have not heard this message once from an Adventist church service other than one talk I did myself at my local church. This was a comment again in response to the series of articles that Dr. Larson shared that appeared in the Adventist Review. So now I want to move on to part 2 of our conversation. And this part will look at the challenge that we face with global climate change emissions by these numbers. The overall carbon footprint annually around the world is 40 billion metric tons. Now, from last year, it says about 32 billion metric tons, 33 billion metric tons. But through 2030, with economic growth at around 2.2%, it expresses at 40 billion metric tons. The US carbon footprint is around 5 billion metric tons. In California, the climate emissions are around 423 billion metric tons. The average carbon emissions of a US person is 16 metric tons. Now get this, the transportation sector emissions per person averaged is about 7 metric tons. If Adventists drove, in the US drove at 65 miles an hour, one can expect, based on the analysis that we'll be discussing, one can expect a reduction of about 0.53 metric tons. That's a very important number. And you can see, compared to 7 metric tons, is around a 10%, 8 to 10% reduction. What are some of the responses to these challenges? At the policy level, there have been the Tokyo Protocol, there have been the Montreal Protocol, and now I think the Paris Accords, not remembering the year now, but it was during the Obama administration. And the Paris Accords identify actions that jurisdictions around the world need to take to keep global temperatures from rising above 1.5 degrees C. And some people say 2 degrees C. In the US, there are EPA rulemakings that go through challenges and so on and so forth. I also want to highlight the California example because California represents the most comprehensive, consistent actions on the policy front, the regulatory front, programmatic front, and the commitment of funding. I'll get into these responses later on. Businesses are making announcements, declarations, and pledges. Amazon has an Amazon pledge. BP and Shell have tied CEO and executive staff payment to their GHG performance, the climate emissions performance. The World Resources Institute developed a measurement framework that most businesses use, but it's voluntary, it's not mandatory. And that particular framework looks at emissions that are directly caused by a company's operation. And then there are indirect components from that company's operation. And then they also count the supply chain emissions. They define all of those emission categories as Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Institutions are also looking at different types of responses. Some are sourcing electricity supplies from renewables. Others are practicing efficiency. Others are implementing ecology in their core missions. Individuals are looking at improving their awareness of climate change emissions. Some act to reduce their consumption, reuse, recycle. Others are practicing efficiency, conservation, fuel substitution, and so on. The status of all of these responses is, how shall I put this, perhaps not too encouraging, because from that meeting at the White House, it was said that no nation is on track to meet the Paris 2.0 goals. This is the 2-degree goal. Many companies have announced net zero 2050 plans, but they're still feeling their way. And net zero simply means that if you add up all of the emissions from a company's operation, they want to get to a point where they don't have any excess emissions. But most lack a common measurement standard to evaluate what net zero 2050 means or evaluate their progress. And as I mentioned, California remains the only state with a comprehensive strategy, legislative, regulatory, and policy framework for a path to a possible net zero 2050 economy-wide outcome. But the trajectory remains uncertain. I want to highlight a few of the California actions. So AB 32, Assembly Bill 32, is the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006. That piece of legislation required California to target reducing its carbon emissions by 90% below 1990 levels. That legislation also allowed the state to set up the world's only functioning cap and trade regime, although the European Union also has one. And then the low carbon fuel standard, which was an early action item under AB 32, which was the framework that we did our work at the Energy Commission and at the Air Resources Board. The low carbon fuel standard simply says that initially oil companies would reduce by 10% the carbon intensity of their fuels on a full fuel cycle analysis basis. That target has been changed to a 20% reduction by 2030. Senate Bill 32, SB 32, brings forward the AB 32 goals a little closer and sets a 50% reduction below 1990 levels by 2030. SB 350 requires the widespread electrification of the transportation sector in California. The California Public Utilities Commission set up a program for all of the investor-owned utilities in California. That would be San Diego Gas and Electric Company, Southern California Edison, Pacific Gas and Electric Company, to do some project demonstrations. And we were pleased to have been one of the 16 first projects that received funding under that framework with our colleagues out there in San Diego. SB 100 defines a target that by 2045, all of the electricity generated in California will be renewable or zero emission. AB 2076 was a very important work that the California Energy Commission and Air Resources Board undertook. That work was a joint agency effort that identified policy strategies and action items to reduce California's dependence on petroleum fuels. There were 5 items that were identified in that work. First was efficiency. The second was conservation. The third was fuel substitution. The fourth was land use planning. And the fifth was reducing vehicle miles traveled. Out of the 5, AB 1007, Assembly Bill 1007, required both agencies to develop the state alternative fuels plan. And I happen to be one of the principal authors of that report. And the full fuel cycle analysis work that I have referred to was a component of this proceeding. AB 118 is also a very important piece of California legislative action. That made monies available for Californians to research, develop, and deploy advanced transportation technologies that would lead to a reduction in carbon emissions in the transportation sector. And then finally, SB 375 requires all municipal planning agencies to incorporate carbon emission reduction strategies in their city planning efforts. So as you can see in that, sorry for the long summary, but I want to point out how California is distinguished amongst all of the political jurisdictions in acting to decarbonize its economy. But as I said, the trajectory to all of these outcomes remains uncertain. This leads us to looking at individual actions which seem a compelling priority against this backdrop of challenges. So in part 3, I'd like us to now look at the cumulative effects and systemic impacts from individual actions to address climate emissions. And to do so, we want to look closely at what driving at 65 miles an hour whenever reasonable and safe would look like by our faith community. I want to point out that as far as I know, this is the first time that any faith community has taken a look at this topic using the framework for California's emissions assessment that we'll look at. But before we get into that assessment, I want to do this quick primer on how to measure fuel cycle emissions. And the tool for that is the grid model. Now, what you see on your screen is a set of steps that we look at in assessing the emissions from the use of a fuel. And that fuel can be anywhere from gasoline, diesel, propane, electricity, a fuel from a nuclear power plant, a fuel from a biomass power plant, solar electricity, wind, hydro, and so forth and so on. But as you can see, the steps involve looking at the energy that's consumed during the resource exploration and extraction process, the initial processing, the transporting of that resource, the refining of that resource, the distribution and marketing of that resource, and then finally, the emissions and energy associated when operating your vehicle. This is another graph that highlights the emissions element of the full fuel cycle analysis. And again, you'll see the production, the processing, the product storage, the transportation, and so on. At the bottom is a quick equation that shows what all of these emissions sum to and the components that go into that summation. So if you took 100% to correspond to the well-to-wheels portion of the emissions, you will see that the well-to-tank portion makes up only 20%. It's a kind of an approximate number, makes up only about 20% of the total emissions. And the tank-to-wheels portion involved in operating the vehicle makes up about 80%. And in the next slide, you will see that this is very important because it relates to the fuel economy of that vehicle, which also relates to the speed or how fast you drive that vehicle. Oh, before we get to that slide, I think the slide is next. There is another element of full fuel cycle analysis that we also consider, and that has to do with the land use change impacts. When the comment was made exhorting us to stop eating meat, it referred to a consideration of these types of land use changes. In this slide, you see in the background a forest, and you see in the middle ground some cows, and in the foreground some grain. If a forest is cut down to make pasture for cattle farming, the loss of the emissions harvesting potential of the trees have to be accounted for in the processing of that cow for food purposes. If the cows are fed corn, the emissions associated with feeding or producing the corn to feed those cows have to be counted. And so those set of emissions are called indirect emissions, and they have to be added to the direct emissions in the earlier slides. When those two things are combined, there is an increase in the total emissions footprint associated with cattle farming. There is an increase associated with the processing of that cattle for food consumption. Therefore, the exhortation to stop eating meat is based on a sound principle or an associate impact environmentally from the consumption of meat. This is the slide that I referred to prematurely. This is another example of the equation that goes into determining the full fuel cycle emissions associated with operating a vehicle or producing electricity. The two components are the so-called well-to-tank component, and then the well and the tank-to-wheels component. In the middle there, you see vehicle fuel economy. This suggests that the vehicle fuel economy component is a big portion of this equation. And as you'll see later on, if your fuel economy is being impacted by how fast you're driving, the total emissions is correspondingly impacted. Now we're going to get into part 3 of the presentation, and we will cover how the individual action to reduce your driving speed influences the emissions associated and the fuel consumed. 65 saves 20. This call out refers to the potential reduction in energy use and the potential reduction in carbon emissions from reducing your freeway driving speed from 70 miles an hour to 65 miles an hour. The third column shows the reduction, I should say the potential reduction in your energy use and your emissions associated with driving at that speed if you drove at 65 instead of 75. And if you're accustomed to driving at 80 miles an hour, if you chose to drive at 65 instead, your energy savings and your reduction in emissions will be 46%. Put a different way, if you're driving at 70 miles an hour instead of 65 miles an hour, you're using 20% more energy or 20% more fuel than if you're driving at 65. You're also increasing your emissions by 20% more than if you're driving at 65. Similarly, looking at column 4, if you're driving at 80 miles an hour, you're using 46% more fuel or energy, and you're increasing your emissions by 46% more than if you're driving at 65. The jumps suggest that the increase, the energy used is not linear, nor are the emissions associated with those speeds. They vary by the cube of the velocity. They vary by the cube of the velocity. That's why you have those jumps. So we take all of this information and calculate or determine the individual carbon emissions associated with those changes in speed or at those different speeds. To assess that, we use the data that you see indicated on the right side of your screen. And this allows anybody else who wants to do this type of a calculation to reproduce the results. One key point I want to share here is that there are some limitations in the results that are shown here, because if you change the data, for example, if you use a different carbon intensity than the 101.6 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per unit of energy, you're going to get a different result. The numbers that are shown here are for California gasoline. So we take the information from the previous slide and apply it across the number of Adventist households, which for the analysis were estimated to be 480,000 households. And those numbers express as 189,000 or 190,000 metric tons of possible CO2 reduction per year, to as high as 490,000 tons of CO2 reduction per year. All of these numbers then can be used into examining the cumulative effects and the systemic impacts of one person reducing or choosing to drive rather at 65 miles an hour. It's important to look at different periods of time to understand the cumulative effect of CO2 reductions from US Adventist households driving at 65 miles an hour than the indicated speeds. And when you do so, what you find is the information in the call out that suggests it's possible to reduce CO2 emissions by between 1 million to as high as 9 million metric tons over a 5-year period and up to a 20-year period. Again, this is important because remember from Dr. Ford's presentation, he emphasized the need to understand the cumulative effects and the systemic impacts. The cumulative effects here suggest that not only can Adventist households impact the CO2 or the climate change emissions picture, but this information could also be extrapolated to Christians in general in the United States. Associated with the choice to drive at 65 miles an hour are cost savings. And in this slide, what we attempt to show is what would happen if an Adventist individual, an Adventist family chose to drive at 65 miles an hour, considering the cost of gasoline at $3.50 a gallon. What you see here is that across a 5-year period, which would be the first set of bars up from the bottom, a minimum of $512 million could be saved, and as high as $1.2 billion. And across 20 years, those savings could be up to $3 billion. Now, the $3 billion and the $500 million are present value numbers using a 10% discount, meaning if you had a series of $107 million, $130 million and $307 million savings over those indicated periods, their value today would be between $512 million and up to $3.1 billion. The nominal value, as you can see in the case of the 20-year period, the blue bar would be over $6 billion. How am I doing with time, Dave? Okay.
You're
Are you
fine,
on?
McKinley. Let's keep
Okay.
going.
Okay, great.
We'll take a break about 11:30. It's no matter how far you are along, and then we'll come back.
Oh, great. Okay. So, based on the information we've discussed so far and the potential outcomes in terms of the savings possible, there are some financial implications for local churches, the church ministry in general, if Adventist families were to choose to drive at 65 miles an hour versus speeds greater. At the household level, it is possible for such families to repurpose those fuel cost savings to increasing offerings, sponsoring an Adventist student's education, or supporting a favorite charity. At the congregation level, it might be possible for those fuel cost savings to support local church needs or make up budget from declines due to the COVID-19 induced offerings shortfall. At the local conference level, similar repurposing can happen. At the division level, fuel cost savings could be repurposed to support ministry priorities suffering budgetary cuts due to COVID-19 induced offerings shortfall. But I think a most important implication here is that it's possible to demonstrate that the Adventist faith community can lead globally on an urgent ecological issue. Remember from one of the slides earlier, even small actions are powerful. Although the total number of emissions reduced by such an Adventist faith community in the US might be small, compared to the large challenges facing the global community. The key here would be to set an example. In part 5, I'm going to wrap up with a closing thought, and then there are questions towards the end that could inform the conversation following the presentation. And the Lord God placed man in the garden and mandated humans to cultivate it and maintain it. In some of the videos that Dr. Larson has shared with the class, some of the presenters have made the case that we humans have a responsibility for earth care. And I think, as we can see from the preceding slides, our choices of how we drive, at what speeds we drive, can be a part of our response to this exhortation to maintain the earth. And as Dr. Larson said in his introductory remarks, we may not necessarily be able to respond to all of the ecological disasters that are happening. At the same time, we as Christians can play a role in acting on information that helps us choose to live in ways that take our lifestyle impact on others into account. Another text that I find relevant to our conversation here is from 1 Chronicles 12:32, which is that the people of Issachar distinguished themselves amongst the list of the tribes of Israel that were mentioned in that chapter by their understanding of the times, or their understanding of the issues that were affecting the people of Israel at the time. And they knew what Israel ought to do. They knew what solutions might work for that circumstance. One of the celebrated side benefits, if one might refer to it that way, of the pandemic has been a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Many climate activists point to that. By my calculation, the per person greenhouse gas emissions reduced by the lockdowns from the pandemic is equivalent to something like 1.32 metric tons. And since the pandemic happens over a 100-year period, once in a 100-year period, we can consider that 2 Adventist Christians in the US practicing driving at 65 can potentially cut climate emissions by 20 times more than reductions from lockdowns of a 100-year pandemic. My closing question is what we started with. It's a stewardship question. What will you do about the climate emissions that some suggest are exposing humans and the planet to an existential threat? That's the talk, and I'll stop and turn it back to Dave.
Thank you, McKinley. This would be a convenient time to take a break, I think. And it is now almost 11:30 here in California. So let's reconvene at 11:40 or so. When we come back, I'd like to hear from 3 people who are professors in the School of Public Health, if they would like to comment. They don't have to, but I'd like to give them an opportunity at the outset to comment. And then we can go to the other people in line. And I invite you, if you'd like to speak or ask a question, to make that known to Forrest how, either by using the mechanical hand or your own physical hand, so he can establish a queue by which people are accorded an opportunity to speak. Okay, the three professors that I know of who are in our group today are Robert Ford, Juan Sabate, and Larry Beeson. Let's find out if they have anything to say about these matters, and then we'll go to the others. So about 11:40, our time, about 10 minutes from now, and we are now going to take what people at Loma Linda call a wellness break. So have fun. McKinley, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Would you mind putting up the list of questions toward the end of your presentation that you didn't have a chance to share? And maybe we can use those to give the discussion a little bit of a direction.
Yes, I will.
Okay, the group can take the discussion anywhere it wants to, but those questions might be points to ponder as we move forward. I'm looking through the list here. Is there anyone else from the School of Public Health or associated with it that I should have mentioned? I think these are the ones I have.
Can you see the slide, the screen?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, let me questions. Okay.
Well, it's about time to begin, I think. And here are some questions from McKinley that we can consider. Would you like to read through those for us, McKinley, please?
Yes, sure. Okay. So it was fun putting these questions together because, again, they relate to many of the comments that I got in the private chat. Number one, is it possible for Adventist Christians to prioritize ecology, as we rightfully do, Sabbath observance? After all, both Sabbath observance and the mandate to tend to the earth are Edenic imperatives from the Creator. Number two, a follow-on question would be, how might earth care imperatives express in our consumption behaviors in, say, how we drive with this new awareness of the 65-mile-an-hour stewardship freeway driving? Number three, are driving at 65 miles an hour and car efficiency choices, meaning if you're in the market to buy a new car, try to get something that gets at least 40 miles to the gallon. Are these forms of temperance? Number four, should critics of political leaders who drive at excessive speed, I should say, should critics who drive at excessive speed of political leaders, maybe, I don't know, speeds, realize they are part of the reason carbon emissions are a challenge in the first place? Number five, do motorists habitually barreling down the freeway at 75 miles an hour or greater have standing to criticize political leaders and policymakers for perceived climate policy inaction? Is this a form of hypocrisy?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, McKinley. Let's see if we can get this onto gallery view here so we can see people. Maybe you can take that down now. I don't know if that would be convenient, McKinley. Okay,
Yes.
First of all, let me see if Robert Ford, Juan Zabate, or Larry Beeson have something to say, because they are all associated with the School of Public Health, one way or the other. Bob, what comes to your mind, if anything?
Yeah, briefly. And of course, I was many years ago in the School of Public Health, not there now, but still very supportive. Thank you, McKinley. That was a great presentation. A lot of food for thought. The key thing I'd like to focus on is what I mentioned last time and what you underline. The power of cumulative action that can have systemic effects. If we combined our choices in consumption, whether it be the number of cars, how size the car, how fuel standards, all of that, driving standards, along with vegetarian along our lifestyle. I mean, do we live a lifestyle that maybe consumes more than we need to? If we reduce consumption and more benefit, all of that has cumulative benefits. And the idea of cumulative benefits is just like interest in the bank. Small actions add up to big results over time. And I think that is really the key message. And I thank you, McKinley, for underlying that. I think that's really important for us to understand. And thank you.
Thank you, Bob. How about Juan? Do you have something you'd like to say?
Certainly. Well, what a nice surprise. Yesterday, I faithfully watched the video that you recommended, and I thought that today we were going to have a presentation about, animal rights, theology, so on and so forth. And I connected at 11 because I had another commitment, and I was greatly surprised for this nice presentation. McKinley, congratulations. I admire you, and also I'm happy that you are working in setting parameters and policy at the state level, that really, indeed, California is ahead of many other states. My response to this presentation is it clearly specifies that temperance in a global sense goes beyond, the traditional things that we have adopted in the 19th century in Adventism, such as not drinking alcohol or doing certain behaviors. We're in the 21st century, and there are behaviors that have an impact on the ecology. And I think looking at the whole array of behaviors, it has to be, or the whole portfolio of behaviors has to be studied, and it has to be for consideration. As Robert Ford has said, the cumulative effect of many individuals and the cumulative effect many over years, it has an impactful. That's one response. The other one is I did some of these computations as far as the issue of vegetarian diets or not, but I never did at the community level or global level. And I will be happy to work with you, McKinley, in thinking about an array of individual behaviors that Christians can adopt, that the summation of all of them, could have even a greater impact.
Thank you, Juan. Larry.
Thank you.
Larry Beeson, would you like to say something?
Yeah, sure. In the conversation about what comes out of the cars at different speeds, not only greenhouse gases, but other air pollutants as well, oxides of nitrogen and so forth. For the last decade or so, I've been a member of the South Coast Air Quality Management District Advisory, Environmental Justice Advisory Group. And the reason I was invited to be part of that advisory group is because my doctoral dissertation, which was the title of the dissertation was The Association of Long-Term Concentrations of Ambient Air Pollutants and the Incidence of Malignant Neoplasms in Non-Smoking Adults. And that was really based on the first Adventist health study with Roland Phillips and ultimately Gary Fraser. But the idea that because that was the Adventist, it was on the non-smoking. So we can do more to the community other than non-smoking in terms of our health and improving our what we produce to the environment, not only greenhouse gases, but other pollutants that damage our health. And so that idea that we can contribute to collectively as an Adventist population, we promote, and Dr. Sabate mentioned, temperance, temperance in driving, temperance in eating, temperance in smoking, temperance in, what we drink. So all of that is a way that we can improve our health collectively, and my focus was on air pollution, but driving slower reduces the air pollution as well, in addition to greenhouse gases.
Thank you. And I appreciate all of these comments, and we'll get to others. Some of us have been talking, and we will continue talking, and I hope all the rest of you get involved in the conversation about developing a society, maybe called the Society of Adventist Ecologists or Association of Adventist Ecologists or something that could be a kind of focus group promoting these matters. As I envision it now, this society would not do research, service, and education itself, but it would fund people around the circle who would do that. And I think we could make a contribution by encouraging students and scholars to direct their attention to these matters. So how about thinking about it? We'll bring this idea back to you from now and again. And if it seems to be an idea that's good, we'll move ahead on that front. One last comment, and that is we have a new participant today, Diane Kaiser, and we want her to feel welcome to the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School. I said one more comment, I'll make another comment, and that is Roy Branson rarely allowed himself to become melancholy. And I think that's the way to put it, that he rarely allowed himself to become melancholy, at least in my presence. But toward the end of his life, he was somber. I won't go so far as to say he was melancholy, but he was somber in saying, I wish we had been more successful so far in engaging the School of Public Health. That was one of his real hopes, and he died before that hope was realized. So as we continue Roy's legacy, along with other things, let's keep that dream of his that we connect with the School of Public Health more intimately than we have in the past. Let's keep that dream alive. Okay, Forrest.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
All right. Hey, I'd like to ask the first question if I could, and there might not be an answer to this, but McKinley, looks like General Motors said in the year 2035, they're going to go to all electric vehicles. But that electric vehicle needs electricity from some source. So are we just transferring the source of the pollution from the car to the plant that's making the energy?
Thank you, Forrest. Before I answer your question, I just wonder if I can just acknowledge the prior comments of Dr. Sabate
Oh, sure.
and Dr. Beeson and Dr. Ford. I appreciate the comments and the compliments. And as we have time, Larry, there were 3 other appendix slides that I didn't put up that deals exactly with the points that you're raising. I shared those with Dave, and we'll wait to share that with the class because it really, those slides really show us how our actions contribute to either ameliorating a problem or exacerbating the problem. And with the Adventist Church focused on the teaching and healing ministry of our Lord, at least that's the motto of Loma University, it's important for us as a people to understand how our driving contribute to air pollution outcomes and how if we choose to drive differently, we would be advancing our public health message. Now, to Forrest's question, I love this class. You folks ask very incisive questions. Another class member asked the same question. And the answer is, you're right, depending on the electricity mix of the jurisdiction where a car is used, the carbon reduction benefit or the air pollution reduction benefit can vary. there is also another complication in the California context. If we count the emissions from wildfires that have been caused by ignition sources from grid electrical equipment, then in the same way that we treat the indirect emissions from farming, some have argued, and I have done some work in that area, that those emissions should be counted in the electricity that's used for electric vehicles. If you do that, then the emission reduction benefits from electric vehicles are not as great. Now, that is not to say that electric vehicle use should not be considered. What I've argued to my colleagues at the agencies is that they cannot ignore the emissions from wildfires that are due to ignition sources from grid electrical equipment. But in general, you know, some electric vehicle consumers or owners might get their electricity from solar panels on their homes. That would be okay. But if you're in places like the Midwest, that's a challenge. I also mentioned, I think a week or two ago in a class discussion, that a European university has essentially adopted and adapted the California work to all global electricity pathways. And it's a challenging picture, to say the least.
Dave, can I just another little comment?
Sure.
What Larry mentioned, I hope we don't lose it in a discussion. I think it relates to this. He mentioned a word that for us in public health is very well known, the issue of environmental justice. Environmental justice refers to how the impacts, whether they be systemic or individual or community, affect the most vulnerable peoples in the world. I know that if we go back into Adventist's health message, a lot of, Ellen G. White and her son and others, when they went to the South to work among the Blacks and to develop health work. And so we need to realize that it's not just for our own health benefits, but we need to think of who are the most vulnerable. If anything, this pandemic has shown us the inequities in health systems, the inequities in behaviors, and what they have, the impacts they have on, and I'm particularly cognizant of what the effects are on the Native American communities here. So I think that needs to be brought into our equation as a moral and ethical responsibility, besides just good behavior as an issue.
Yeah, can I comment on that a little bit? As part of the environmental justice group that I'm part of with AQMD, we find out that the people of color tend to live closest to the freeways. That's where the houses and the apartments are cheapest, when they're within yards of the major transportation corridors, the I-10 and the 210 and so forth. We find out that the people, people of color tend to live in the cheaper houses for a variety of reasons. They're less income. And so what we produce out of the tailpipes of our cars inadvertently affects them more than the people who are living miles and miles away from the transportation corridors. So that environmental justice, I think, is an important contribution that we can make, taking consideration the people of color that are adversely affected by what we do as a community, including driving.
All right, thank you. Are you, I'm ready to go on now to Rodney Corker.
Thank you, McKinley. Always thoughtful. I love listening to you talk and your questions and presentation here. Thank you. I've got 3 quick questions. You can just choose one in the interest of time. But I'm going to quickly put out 3 questions for you. And there's an underlying question, that is, how do you make Mr. Joe Public care enough to change their lifestyle? And my first question is, when I came to Loma Linda in 1980, it was difficult on some days to see the mountains. And there was a system in place whereby we were told when there were severe hazard days and recommended that we stay inside. I belonged to a running club, and several times we had to cancel our running sessions in the morning because the declaration from the public health authorities was that it just wasn't safe enough. And so, excuse the pun, but it is clearly that the days are more clear. These days are gone. And so we have made some gains. And I really long for an environmental activist to share some gains with us so that we just don't fall back into thinking that we aren't getting anywhere. The problem's too big. We clearly have made some gains. So if you could just give 2 or 3 gains that have been made in the last 30 years that I've been living in Southern California, I would really enjoy that. My second question is has to do with the waiver that was given to the trucking industry. This seemed to be an economic political decision, and it was very annoying to me to be driving along at a modest speed and seeing these trucks spew out large amounts of visible particulate emissions. And I'd like you, if you could, just update where we are on that. But therein, I have a problem with, personally, with the 65-mile-an-hour speed limit, because I drive a motorhome. It's a diesel pusher. I have to drive in the truck lanes, and it is extremely annoying to truckers to have a motorhome doing 65 mile an hour in front of a marauding herd of trucks that want to do 70 and 75 miles an hour. It's simply not safe, and it makes them angry. I also ride Harley Davidsons, or did until recently. And one of the safety rules is there, if you're doing 70 or 75 mile an hour, never back up into a 65 mile an hour problem. It will kill you. So you will always accelerate forward into a safety zone. I'm just making a couple of points here that there are safety considerations and defining what it is somewhat problematic for everybody just to go to 65 miles an hour. For 2 of my vehicles, it is unsafe and it just doesn't work. But there's an ethical issue, and that is where I do kick in. And my PhD is also in public health, but it's in economics. But for example, and that gets to my third question, and I'll leave it there, and that is the debate between the power of consumer demand versus government regulation. I've read articles where changing human purchasing patterns has been much more effective than regulation, to the extent of 17 times more effective. And I don't know whether that's true or not. I want you to respond to that. But therein, it was my personal ethical decision in deciding I no longer need to drive a V8 vehicle. You know, a V6 or even a V4 with a turbo will give me the power I need and will get me there. So for the last 20 years, no more V8s for Rodney. It's simply wasteful, and I can't justify it. When I bought a motorhome, I don't need 450 horsepower Cummins motor to push me around. A 330 gets me there just fine. So I've made my decision, made my ethical commitment on that basis. But I'd like you to comment, if you've got time, on the overall power of changing consumer patterns, because I think it was the consumer industry purchasing and demanding and insisting upon more efficient motors in the 90s decade and going into the 2000s, where people gave up on their V8s and went for smaller motors and insisted that the producers meet their demand. It gets back into the demand legislative debate. I'll leave it there. There's plenty there for you to chew on, McKinley. Have fun with it.
Thank you very much, first, for your compliment, and thank you for your questions. What's exciting about this conversation, as I mentioned, is the response from the class. I was surprised that people responded to that 65 mile an hour suggestion by actually driving it. What I have found in my work and in dealing with the policymakers and the business community, even people on Wall Street, is that if you gave them information that's credible, they will respond positively. So to your first question, how to make Joe Public care enough to change their lifestyle? Educate. Present the information in a way that shows them, look, if you're driving at 75, you're increasing your fuel use by 35%. If you're driving at 80 miles an hour, you're increasing your fuel use by 46%. I was surprised that the agencies have not emphasized this. In fact, in one email response to a colleague this week, when I mentioned that I was going to do this presentation, I shared with him that the 65-mile-an-hour speed limit has been informed by a desire to maintain safety on the roadways where 65 miles an hour speed limit exists. But I've not heard any arguments about climate emissions or criteria pollutants as a motivation for that 65 mile an hour speed limit. So there's an opportunity to educate here and inform. Second question, waiver given to the trucking industry. The state is acting in different ways to introduce new technologies and new standards to help trucks reduce their emissions. So for example, the Air Resources Board is moving towards requiring near zero and zero emission engines for trucks. Diesel engines are not in the position with the existing technology to meet those standards, but thankfully, natural gas engines now do. In fact, we argue that natural gas engines are comparable to the power plant emissions in California that generate electricity electric vehicles use. And so therefore, natural gas engines, near zero emission natural gas engines are similar to zero tailpipe electric vehicles. Annoying trucks driving at 65, 75. Yes, that also was a comment in the chat. And my recommendation to the colleagues who asked the question was find a middle lane. If there are 3 or more lanes, and drive in that lane. That will allow those who are barreling past at 75 or 80 miles an hour to either drive around you, and you avoid the annoyance or the safety hazard of coming up on people who are driving at 55 or slower in the slow lane. Those strategies have worked for me. As I shared with the class, I consistently drive at 65 miles an hour because it's important to me for my fuel economy gauge to show that I'm getting 40 miles to the gallon whenever I do a long trip. One last thing to the other question that Rodney asked, 2 or 3 gains in Southern California. Yes, the air pollution levels in Southern California have changed and improved significantly over the years because of the air quality regulations and the standards. But on certain days of the week, the pollution levels do exceed ambient air quality safety standards. For example, one Sabbath in San Bernardino, I think the reading was in the hazardous region. Nevertheless, actions are being taken to continue to improve the air quality in Southern California. Finally, the Air Resources Board is working on new fuel economy standards for trucks, which are the major sources of the pollution problem in Southern California. The trucks in California make up only about 4% of the vehicle population, but contribute to about 60% of the oxides of nitrogen emissions and the particulate emissions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I want to go to Monty now. Monty?
Yeah, here I go.
Okay,
McKinley, thank you very much for this presentation. I really enjoyed it. And just the other day, Lisa and I traveled from Beaumont to Loma Linda. Actually, our last number of trips, we've been trying to do the 65 thing. And for the most part, we're able to do that. I will confess on 2 counts. And one is that when I'm not trying to drive 65, I usually just cruise with the traffic in the fast lane, which from here to Loma Linda, if it's not heavy traffic, is 80. So my gains by traveling 65 are much higher than the 20%, which is a little convincing to me. My question has to do with policymakers, and so maybe Larry might have something to say about this too, being on the board that he's on. Where do policymakers see remote working fit into this, and why aren't policymakers making more of a push for it? And I would, if we bring it back to the focus of your presentation, why aren't our Adventist administrators making a greater push for remote working rather than having us all commute in? I noticed just a little ways into the pandemic, we had people working at home and that happened. And then as soon as there was this sense that people could come back to work, the automatic response was bring everybody back, without thinking about, do we need to bring people back? So that's my question. Where do you see this whole idea of remote working, which reduces my emissions to 0 from my car on the days that I commute?
Thank you, Monty, for your question. Now that you've mentioned Lisa and you trying to drive at 65 miles an hour, I should share with the class that Lisa was one of the class members who shared that she was practicing driving at 65 in the week following the conversation. So on remote working, I know that the state has had a policy of encouraging agencies to implement what's called the alternative work schedule over time. And this was even before the pandemic. And different agencies would apply that practice or grant that option to their employees. I know that when I first started working at the Energy Commission, a requirement in my contract with them was that I would not go into work on Mondays. That was a very important part of considering working at that agency. Nobody.
Yeah, so.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so for both Loma Linda and I do some work for La Sierra, so I end up doing it for them. I think it's maybe on a quarterly basis, I report my commuting habits, but I've never received encouragement or, for me, I'm contract, so I actually do telecommute some, but that's not because of encouragement from Loma Linda or La Sierra, but Lisa, working as an administrative assistant, boy, that's frowned upon. They want people in the office, and my sense is I teach supervision. My perspective on that is many supervisors are uncomfortable supervising people's performance. They want the easier route of just being able to see that the person's sitting at their desk. And there seems to be a great reluctance to supervise performance, which of course can be done while people are working remotely.
Quick response to that. So one of the benefits of this exercise that we as a class have done, and again, I just have to congratulate the class for their responses to this 65-mile-an-hour suggestion, is it forced me to re-examine the policy recommendations from the AB 2076 report, or the so-called Shelley report. The conservation element was really and has never really been pushed by the state. And I think it's because nobody has really looked at the information in the way that we're discussing it. So one of the things I'm hoping to do from these conversations is to raise this conservation action item in some of the conversations with my colleagues at the agencies. It clearly is the lowest hanging fruit, in addition to efficiency gains, that can address and respond to the climate emissions challenges that the state is trying to deal with. And the other important thing is that it doesn't cost anything. You know, you don't have to buy a $46,000 electric vehicle to reduce your carbon emissions. Just drive 65 whenever safe and reasonable. So thank you for your question.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking at my list. Eduardo.
Forrest, I would like Bonnie to go ahead of me if she wants to.
Bonnie, would you like to go ahead?
It doesn't matter. I am not in a hurry. I just wanted to congratulate the class on digging into this topic in such a significant way, and mention, and maybe since I haven't heard all of the conversations that you've had for the last couple of weeks about this, but a couple of resources. I don't know, has anybody talked about the group Interfaith Power and Light? They're a religious response to global warming. They're based in Oakland, and they do all kinds of things with local congregations on how to respond to global warming. And the other one that I wanted to mention is a book that I read this past year that's called The Story of More. And it's by Hope Jahren. And it is how a very readable little paperback about how we got to where we are in the state of global warming and how things that we can do about it. And so I highly recommend that. She's a science writer and addresses the issue. She does comparisons a lot between like 1969 and now, so that you can see the difference of what has happened in our lifetime on just a whole bunch of different issues. And it's a really good read and worthwhile. So,
Bonnie, could you go to the chat and type that in
yes,
for everybody? That would be helpful. Thank you very much, Bonnie.
Let me just mention to Bonnie, I think it's a couple of weeks ago, we listened for parts of a webinar by Catherine Hayhoe, and she was interviewed by the president of Interfaith Power and Light.
Yeah.
So you might want to, it's a very, very important group to follow, and I think we have a lot to learn from them. So thank you for reminding people of that. Interfaith Power and Light, based in the Bay Area. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Bonnie.
I will go back and listen to that, Bob.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Now can I come to you, Eduardo?
Yes, thank you. McKinley, Larry mentioned that the Black population have the tendency to live near to the freeways because the houses are cheaper. When we see the structure of the society, I think that we are forced to become polluters. Maybe if we try to structure of the society, we can improve to reduce pollution. I guess that many people, especially the 17 million people that are suffering of depression, would like to drive less. Not only less speed, but less time. But most of them, they cannot afford to break from the system. And my last comment is that in Sister White Times, she mentioned of a health institution where the workers were picking little by little, one pecan apple, another and a pecan orange, a banana. And then she mentioned at the end of the day, the burden for the institution is big. And I think that mathematically, the little things that we can do improve the whole society. But I think that if people do not address the structure of the society, especially the polluters, I mean, the people, many of the people are drinking coffee, smoking cigarette, drinking beer. So their brains, I think they are not capable of much good for the society. And I guess that we cannot expect a dramatical change if we don't address the root of the evil. That's my comment. Thank you very much.
Okay. McKinley,
you,
did you want
Eduardo.
to? Okay.
Well, I think a quick response to the comment is policymakers are doing their best to understand a lot of the changes that are happening in society and affecting people. And in response to Dr. Beeson and Dr. Ford's comments about environmental justice, California currently requires 25% of all of their funding under the Global Climate Fund that the Air Resources Board administers to be allocated to projects that ameliorate emissions impacting what's called now disadvantaged communities. And so any proposal that comes into any of the agencies, whether the Energy Commission or the Air Resources Board for funding, has to make sure that 25% of that funding is spent in those communities. There are incentives available for people in disadvantaged communities to also get electric vehicles as opportunities arise. But short answer is there are folks that are looking at some of these things. They are complex problems, and they'll take some time to solve.
Forrest, may I interject right
Yeah.
here just for a second,
Yeah,
please?
go ahead, David.
Donna Carlson says that people don't always know when I'm kidding and when I'm not. And I need to clarify something from last week. Some of you may recall that Eduardo began his comment by referring to my farm in Mexico, that is David's farm in Mexico. And when he concluded his comment, I said, be sure to take care of my farm because I plan to go there during the time of trouble. Well, people have wondered about our property in Mexico. We don't have any property in Mexico. That is actually Eduardo's farm. But since we're going to go there for the time of trouble, he kindly refers to it as our farm. But it really, that acreage belongs to Eduardo, and I hope he keeps it for a long time because we might need it in the future.
Okay, thank you for that explanation, David. Okay, I'm going to go to Bronwyn now.
Good morning. Yes, I'd like to comment on something that Monty said. Monty, when you talked about commuting to Loma Linda and La Sierra and that nobody has really said anything, I think it's because the average person doesn't even think about this. Having grown up on the west coast of South Australia on a 20,000 acre wheat and sheep farm, we only had well water where we were. We didn't have showers. We didn't even have electricity for the first few months. And so I have grown up being very environmentally cautious and conscious. But I think when I came to the States 37 years ago, It was like a throwaway society. So I think it's not even thought about very much. So I just wanted to make that comment. And then on the chats, Elma Capino has put up something about living near to the, if I can find it.
You live near the Amish.
Near the Amish. And I'm wondering, Elmer, if you would comment on how they handle some of these things. Thank you.
Well, Forrest should know this. Most of their vehicles are horse-driven.
And their farm vehicles are horse driven too, because they say a tractor doesn't give good manure.
I live 40 miles from Lancaster. That's a big Amish community.
Yes.
That's
And-
Lancaster. That's Lancaster, Elmer.
Okay. Wrong syllable. But we try to evade the city because their vehicles drive so slow.
Okay. Did you want to continue, Bronwyn?
No, I think, no, I don't think so. I just think when McKinley first mentioned the 65 miles an hour, I was really intrigued. And I was one of the people who tried it, and doing it in the lane I did it, it was a logistical nightmare. But I talked to McKinley about it and he told me how to improve it. So that was good. Yeah, I think it's something that we don't do as a church because nobody's really thought about it. And I think this could be the beginning of something really important and really special. And if our class can trigger things off, that's great.
Okay, thank you, Bronwyn. Did
Okay.
you want to respond to that, McKinley?
Yes, if I may. Hi, Bron.
Hi.
I'm laughing. I'm laughing because Bronwyn peppered me with questions when we spoke this week.
Yeah.
I think the overall observation here is that as people become aware of the importance of the energy consumed by driving speeds or at different driving speeds, they're likely to step back and think.
Mhm.
Typically, again, when I'm having conversations with some of my colleagues who've not thought about something in the way that I've thought, the response is, I haven't thought about it that way. Let me see what I can do. In fact, I shared the Adventist Review article that Dr. Larson sent out to the class with some of my colleagues at Berkeley. And one response I got back was a colleague pulling a comment from a book that is written by a professor out of the University of Texas, Austin, on how certain economic models don't even consider the energy inputs when analyzing the US economy. And this professor found that appalling because it's an incomplete review or an incomplete characterization of economic performance if you don't consider the primary driver of economic performance. And so to the extent that we can make people aware of the energy consequences of driving, I think we might have a different response, a how shall I say, possible change in behavior, as illustrated by the responses in this class. I mean, you've asked a ton of questions, you've made a ton of comments, and to my surprise. So I think if the class were to be a sort of a cohort driving 65, you don't have to do it every day. Do it when you can, when it's safe. And just note the changes. And we can point out to this class in, Loma Linda University is known as a blue zone. The Loma Linda area, I should say. Perhaps it could be known as an ecological zone. Who knows?
A green zone.
A green zone.
Yeah.
Add another element to that. Again, McKinley, you mentioned the land use effects. I think one of the things that we can do is to encourage a lot of good things that are happening in various towns to make communities more walkable, to make it optional for people to live closer to where they work and a safer and a healthier, and tree planting. I know in our little community here in southern Utah, this has become a big issue. Creating bicycle paths, encouraging people to ride and to walk instead of to drive. The land use aspects of this is really important, and this gets into where about how you vote, who your county commissioners are, how informed is your the land use planning board. And a lot of the benefits, the best benefits, can occur at a community or a municipal level, not just at the international or state level.
Okay, thank you. Jeff or Donna, you had your hand up earlier. I don't know if you still want to say something.
Well, I've stepped out for a while, so I don't know if this question's been asked. I noticed Roger McQuiston brought up what I was going to ask about, and that is when we had the energy embargo, 55 was the rule, and I remember police pulling people over if they went 57. So one question is, and Roger brought this up, why is 60, why'd you pick 65 as opposed to 55? And the second part of the question is, what would be the energy saving if it was 55 instead of 65? I suspect 65 is a political compromise of what you can expect human beings to do, but I'd like your viewpoint on that. Thank you. Oh, by the way, I like your talk too.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it. Yes, very good questions, I should say. So, I tried driving at 55 from Reno to San Francisco. And even though it was a challenge, I did achieve the objective I was looking for, which is I wanted to know how well my vehicle would do at 55 miles an hour. And I was pleased with the result. At the time it was, I don't know, maybe about 5, 6, 7 years ago. It was a different car than I'm driving now. Yeah, I got the fuel economy numbers I was looking for. But I also found that it took a lot of time, more time than I wanted to spend. And so 65 became the next, test point, if you like. And I found that 65 is a good compromise between 55 and 70. So if I'm driving from San Francisco to Los Angeles, 65 adds about half an hour more to the drive. That's fine. I load up the car with my music, and it's great. And I also do a lot of note taking when I'm driving. So it's a work time for me, and 7 hours goes by very quickly. Okay, the last question, I have to do a quick calculation here. So if you just bear with me, I will tell you. And this was 55 versus 70, right?
Or 55 versus 65.
Oh, 55 versus 65, okay. So just very quickly here.
See, I remember my dad telling me when I was a kid that after you got over 45, the miles per gallon significantly dropped off. So. Well, I didn't mean to consume it.
That's okay. Okay, so 40% savings.
40%.
Right.
Between the two, between 55 and 65?
That is correct, yes. And again, it's because the relationship, the energy consumption relationship is not linear. It varies by the cube of the velocity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I find myself driving between 55 and 65 since I got my Prius. Not that the Prius can't go faster, but it just feels like I'm going fast in a Prius. Whereas when I ride in Donna's car, I find myself at 70 or 80 miles an hour. Now, would you cut me some slack if her car was an electric one?
No, because the question is energy consumption. Whether you're using gasoline or electricity, you're using energy, and the consumption increases correspondingly with speed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your
All right,
question.
Bronwyn has her hand up again. Bronwyn? You're muted, Bronwyn.
Thank you. I have a question for Bonnie. Bonnie, would it be possible to write an article or a report of what's happened here this morning or something associated with it so we could start a conversation to enlighten people's consciousness about this topic?
Sure. We're a content hungry organization. All the content we can get, we're excited for. So if someone from the class would like to write something up about your experience doing the 65-mile-an-hour, maybe you want to challenge the rest of the church, to join you in doing this, we would be thrilled and excited.
McKinley?
Okay, all right. Danilo.
Roger has his hand up too.
Oh, Roger, I'm sorry. Danilo, let me get Roger first.
McKinley, I'm just wondering, we used to hear a lot about peak oil and not so much anymore. And yet I understand that it's still an issue and that we may see sometime in the future where our energy prices, because they're so low, it makes it impractical for the producers to produce. And if they're too high, the consumer doesn't drive. So consequently, we may see peak oil become an issue again. Any thoughts on that?
Thank you for that question. So the peak oil theory has changed over the years, and I don't subscribe to it because of technology innovations. In the 2000s, nobody ever thought that fracking, as is known in the industry, would be possible. But that technology innovation by a wildcatter out of Texas changed the prospect for oil exploration in the US and around the world. And so as more oil producers, oil and gas producers find more resources that they can apply fracking technology to, they've been able to increase their production, their reserves. So I don't expect that we will encounter a peak oil type condition in the future. A second reason for that statement is that as other alternative fuels come online, the demand for oil will fall. And perhaps at one point here after Danilo asks his question, I can put up the slides that I shared with David from the appendix and then show a couple of other things related to Dr. Beeson's comments and response to Roger's question as well.
Roger, did you want to continue?
Yeah, I was just wondering if my understanding that the fracking aspect of light oil up in the Balkans, up in the Dakotas, and then I think it's the Marcellus there in Texas, that they're seeing huge drop-offs initially. So even though it has brought on initial increase in production, that those fields are being less productive now, and that the oil industry has been operating on debt, that the prices have been such that the fracking is so high that they're heavily in debt and consequently could make some, have some effect on oil production in the future. I just wonder if you have anything to say about that.
Yes, the observation is correct that a lot of oil companies, particularly those using fracking to explore for oil in places like the Marcellus Shale, but in the Permian Basin, there is a lot of oil resource, and even though oil producers and gas producers using fracking do see a steep decline in the reserves of the wells, they can move on to other places. And again, it's not only in the United States where fracking opportunities exist. I know that the Chinese are also looking at that. But I think the bigger point is that over time, because of an increase in the resources available for transportation uses, it's likely that the balance of demand and supply will be distributed in such a way that there may still be oil, and so I don't expect that peak oil will happen. Again, if you just look at the history of the impact of technology innovation on oil production, I'm reluctant to share the peak oil theory.
Just one last comment, if I may. There's a geologist by the name of Art Brennan who does analysis of fields, and especially in the area of the tight oil. And I'm just wondering if you're familiar with his work and what he's projecting. Art Brennan is his name.
His name doesn't come to mind immediately, but I'm familiar with the tight oil resource opportunity. And if tight oil is considered, I think the projections by the U.S. Geological Survey suggest that the U.S. could have in excess of 300 billion barrels of oil reserve. You look at nations like Venezuela, similar observations can be made. But again, it's going to be all driven by technology innovation and what's available and at what cost.
Just one last thought. The net return on oil, invested, I think is what a lot of geologists look at, in the fact that, 100 years ago, you could get 100 barrels of oil by investing 1 barrel of oil. And today the ratio is somewhere to 10 to 15 to 1, even with the tight oil. So I think there are those geologists who say, this is still an issue, and as we go into the future, it's going to have to be addressed with other types of energy sources. So, just an interesting areas.
Okay.
I agree with you.
Okay. Okay, I want to go to Danilo now.
Some time ago, I watched an episode of Mythbusters where they looked at the effect of impatient driving, right in a city setting. And what struck me is that impatient driving may actually be more energy consuming than highway driving at whatever speeds, because you're basically accelerating rapidly and then having to brake rapidly a lot, very frequently, which is a much more energy consuming process. Lately, I've become aware of my own, how do I put it, impatient driving, and I've been trying to be a little bit less impatient. And as a result, I've discovered that I'm getting more MPGs, which is always nice to see.
Yes. So yes, Dr. Boskovic, the analysis that I shared with the class does look at and include the effect of impatient driving. That is hard braking, rapid acceleration, and so on and so forth. The efficiency gain from what's called uniform acceleration and uniform braking is between 3 to 5%. And so it does improve that overall number. So if you include the efficiency gains from impatient driving, as you put it, that 20% becomes 23%, and that 35% becomes 38%, and 46% approaches 50%.
Okay, thank you.
Just,
You were
just
saying
as
more,
a
Hannibal?
thought, yeah. For those of us who spend most of our driving inside of a city rather than on a highway, it seems like more of a concern of how we actually drive.
Yes, and that is where the technology choice option comes in. One of the elements that I included in the analysis was considering if 10% of the 480,000 Adventist households that I estimated in the U.S. Were buying new cars every year, what would happen if those 10% chose more efficient vehicles? So this would include vehicles that have stop-start technology, or perhaps even hybrid technology. So if you're in the city and you're at a stop sign or at the light, your vehicle shuts off automatically and restarts automatically when you remove your foot from the pedal. And of course, if you're driving a Prius, as Jeff and Donna are, that also approaches or takes into account that kind of concern for in-city driving.
I would insert that it's enjoyable to watch the little figure on the display. That when I take my foot off the accelerator, the energy goes from the wheels up to the battery. So, if you're impatient, you may want to think about a hybrid or an electric car.
And then there are things like regenerative braking that hybrids incorporate in their powertrains, and that also, contributes to efficiency gains in city driving. Again, what's fascinating about all of this, you can tell this really stimulates my thinking. We've looked at all of this stuff at the Energy Commission, and that's the role of that agency. So all of the hybrid vehicle technologies, all of the fuels, you name it, the hydrogen fuel cells, we've looked at that stuff. And so we have a very good understanding of what's possible. It only remains for, I think, the relevant agencies, the other market actors to inform consumers about what's possible and give those consumers a chance to act. Forrest, before you go on to somebody else, I just wonder if I may share this screen.
Dave, I don't have any other. I did have a question to ask you. If I drive all week, let's say 10 hours at 45 miles per hour average, can I then drive the next 10 hours at 80 miles an hour? Would that kind of works out to 65?
No, that's a good escape. That's a good escape, Forrest.
Okay, show us what you have, McKinley.
Thank you very much. I want to respect the class's time. Okay. Can you see that?
There we go. Appendix slide 2.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, great. Okay. So let me just see if I can go back. Oh, yes, to the beginning here. Up. Okay. All right. There you go. Okay. So I think it was Roger's question with respect to peak oil. Here in this slide, I show all of the fuels and then some that we considered in the AB 1007 assessment and the State Alternative Fuels Plan. You can see that at the bottom, the purple, excuse me, the purple segment represents a decline in gasoline demand, while the rest of the slivers show penetrations of different types of fuels. Now, excuse me, over time, these slivers are going to change, but the big point here is that we've looked at different portfolios of fuels in California that can lead to the greenhouse gas emission reduction outcomes that the state is looking at, and it is likely that reduced petroleum consumption will occur. Now, will it make an impact across the country or across the world? I can't say, but I do know, excuse me, that other jurisdictions are looking at and adopting the California work. So, for example, in Oregon, I advise the Oregon Governor's Office on their 1,000,000 tons by 2025 plan. And we essentially took the California work and adopted it to Oregon circumstances. So you're seeing some of what's happening in California looked at by other states. I know Washington State is also looking at their own low carbon fuel standard. Oregon now has the Oregon Clean Fuel Standard, which copies what California did. So whether peak oil will occur or not remains to be seen. Okay, I want to jump down to Larry's comments. And Larry mentioned the other pollutants associated with increased vehicle speed or reducing vehicle speed. Recall that the meaning of GREET is greenhouse gases regulated emissions. Those would be the criteria pollutants. Those would be the toxics that this work looked at. And you will see in this slide where for all of the vehicle fuels that we looked at for light-duty passenger vehicles, these are the well-to-wheel numbers. At the base of this slide is the gasoline vehicle, and then right above that is the hybrid electric vehicle, and then you can see the third bar above that is for propane, natural gas, and so on and so forth. Notice above that, say from the top, the second bar is for electric vehicles. And you can see the different pollutants that we looked at. So the oxides of nitrogen, the volatile organic compounds, the carbon monoxide emissions, and then the particulate emissions. As you increase your vehicle speed from, say, 65, all of these things are going to correspondingly increase and impact the communities that are near the freeways where you're driving. And this, brings up the point we were making in the earlier discussions. Now that we know these impacts are happening as a function of vehicle speed, do we have a mature responsibility to choose differently? And this goes to one of the comments from the class. If we have a reason and we know a reason to change our behavior to a beneficial outcome, should we do so? The next slide shows the toxic emissions, and these are all cancer-causing substances. So you got diesel particulate, the gray one, the yellow one, benzene, 1,3-butadiene, formaldehyde, acetaldehyde. All of these reflect in the health outcomes for communities that we are supposed to be administering to, doing the teaching and healing thing. As we get to know more about these things, I think we should choose to act, again, not dictating any solution here, not prescribing any solution, but now that you know, we go back to that question, the stewardship question. What will you do about it? And then to Bronwyn's question and Bonnie's response, if you're driving at 65 and you want to share that story in whatever way that you choose to, perhaps it might inspire other people to choose differently. That's it.
All right, David, I think over to you. Or did you have more, McKinley? I don't have any more questions on the board here.
No, I don't have anything else but to just express my my gratitude to the class for the opportunity to share this. I'll say that you happen to be the very first church setting where some of this information has been shared. The community of people who track this work is very, very small. One other thing that I'll share is that a few people make a lot of decisions that affect a lot of people. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, but it's the nature of the work. And therefore, to expand the participation level, to Dr. Ford's point, education of our people so that they're prepared and equipped to participate in these types of conversations is extremely important if you want to shape the future. Folks who are concerned about inequities in society, protesting and all that is good, but education in energy that affects all of our lives is extremely important. I cannot emphasize that in a greater way. Thank you.
In that regard, I'd like to see us help our colleges to define and develop new majors such as environmental engineering, land use planning, atmospheric science, not just preparing everybody to go to medical and dental school. Nothing to say against the medical and dental profession, but I think we can expand the options of our youth so they can realize that in this era, the 21st century, people that want to do science can find other ways of serving and be very challenged.
I agree with you, Bob, and it's particularly important because you will notice that the research universities involved in this work sort of confined to a small group. In fact, I think out of a lot of the billions of dollars that I spent in the United States, only about 13 universities command like 90% of those funds. I'd like to see an Adventist university in that space, and we get in that space by having engineering, environmental, and ecology majors, sustainability majors.
Or we could promote more people to get their Masters of Public Health in the School of Public Health.
That too.
Okay, David?
Well, I like the last comments, particularly Larry's comment. I think that the School of Public Health needs much more support, much more visibility, much more enthusiasm. And I have nothing against clinical medicine. I gave a lot of my life to that, but I think we need to move beyond the doctor-patient, dentist-patient, nurse-patient dyad. We need to talk about other things as well. John Harvey Kellogg was interested in surgery, hardly a better surgeon than John Harvey Kellogg, but also in public health. So we need to have both the right hand of the message and the left hand of the message. Both of them are needed as we move forward.
Yeah, I think that it would, in fact, we talked about this earlier in our school, to have dual degree programs, MD, MPH, DDS, MPH, PharmD, MPH. So having a dual degree, I think an ideal physician would be one who has public health training.
So I think, yes, and I think the opportunities are great. I also think there's an advantage to our church. I think many thoughtful people are disappointed in our denomination. Some are disgruntled, some are even cynical about it. And this project, or something like it, gives us a chance to do something positive that could catch the imagination, I think, of people who are otherwise disappointed in the way our church is going. So good on you. Keep the idea of a Society of Adventist Ecologists alive, and we'll see where that idea goes. Thank you, everybody. Here's the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Happy Sabbath, everybody.
Thank you, McKinley. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, McKinley, for all that work. Very good presentation.
Hey, McKinley, McKinley,
yes.
There's an added benefit of doing 65.
Yes.
And you don't have to worry about smokies.
Yes,
And if somebody goes past you at 80 miles an hour, they're going to get it, not you.
that's correct. That is correct. Monty, tell Lisa thank you for her question.
All right, I will do that. She's right here.
Okay.
McKinley,
Yes.
I'm going to express still my ending concern here, and this goes a little bit off of what Bronwyn was saying. People aren't thinking about telecommuting as part of the formula, and I'm quite frustrated by that because, one, I didn't hear you respond to that as a policy issue. You went back to 65, and I hear the 65 mile an hour thing, and I actually want to try to start practicing that.
Yes. Well,
but
I thought.
Why are you not looking at possibilities of eliminating commuting where it works? Because there's no cost there, not even taking longer to get to work. It takes far less time to get to work because it takes 0 time to get to work. We're at work, but I talked to you about it and I didn't hear about, yeah, that's something we should be pursuing through policy. I actually was doing chat with Larry, and Larry said, well, we look at mobile sources of air pollution. I said, well, commuters are mobile sources, and just because they no longer commute doesn't make them a non-mobile source. And then he said, well, that's just not something we look at. So there again, I find it very frustrating that this possibility of moving, not everyone, of course, but a significant portion of our population to telecommuting seems to be an issue that not only isn't talked about, but there's, and I even saw it today, there's a barrier to moving into considering that. If someone's writing an article about that in Forum, I would like to see that issue of telecommuting brought up as well in terms of a policy that our conferences and our institutions, educational and medical, might want to look into.
Monty, maybe you could help with the article.
Forgive me. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Monty, maybe you could help with the article and make that your part.
No, I think Monty is really onto something there. I was listening to some economists the other day. They're saying that we don't know yet all of the impacts that this whole pandemic is going to have. But one of the biggest impacts will be on the nature of work itself.
Yeah.
How do we define work? How do we measure what work is? How do we measure productivity? This is going to be a global issue, and it will change a lot of things. So we haven't seen the end of it yet, and we could be leading, on that.
And thank you, Monty, for highlighting the issue again. I thought I sort of mentioned that statewide there is a policy for state workers. I think I'm hearing you say that telecommuting should be a policy that the state encourages private employers as well to implement. And I think I agree with you. We've not seen an emphasis on some of this. That is why this exercise with this class, I think, is very important to me, because again, it raises this conservation question. In the vehicle miles travel reduction element, I know that they've looked at biking, livable cities, and so-called infill. I know telecommuting was a part of it, but again, not receiving the type of emphasis that you are suggesting it should receive. And so it's added to my conversation list. I do meet about every quarter with one of the governor's office's advisors on transportation energy policy, and I'll mention that.
Thank you. And by the way, I'm a little bit of a pot calling a kettle black. Those who remember showing up to class, I'm a hot rodder. I was raised a hot rodder, and I have a V8. One of the different. So It will benefit my hot, but I am not an anxious driver, and I'm not opposed to driving my hot rod 65. And the other thing that's changed since the time when I was growing up, where I could sit in the middle seat and watch the gas gauge of my dad's Ranchero, literally I could watch the gauge go down, the gas gauge. I think he got, when he was driving careful, you know, just regularly, that was probably 12 miles a gallon, and we could easily get below 10. I average city and freeway with a V8 engine, a 5-liter engine, over 20 miles a gallon. So it's amazing the efficiency they've even squeezed out of V8s, but it is one of my sinful indulgences.
Enjoy
Well,
while you can.
McKinley, let me ask you a question. Have you done any research on what seems to be a fad that's growing really rapidly around here is e-bikes, electric bikes that can go pretty fast, you know, and combination of pedal power and even solar run bikes, bicycles, and so on?
I haven't personally, but I know that the Air Resources Board is looking at that, as well as you know, entities like the Union of Concerned Scientists. They have a good transportation program. I believe UC Davis, the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis is also has also looked at e-bikes as part of this response to climate emissions management.
Okay, Saints, I'm going to have to leave, so let's pick it up subsequently.
Okay.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Dave. Thank
Thanks
you,
a lot.
Monty. And Diane, thanks for your question. Have a great day. Alina, Taylor, and Bronwyn. Bernie, happy
Okay.
Sabbath.
Yeah, and I hope McKinley would be part of an article if it's written. I just told Bronwyn I would be open to some consultant, but I'm no expert, but I would certainly hope McKinley would be a key author there, bringing in data.
I
Okay.
think that would be wonderful.
Okay.
I
Have
hate
a good
to do this,
Sabbath.
but I'm going to cut you off. Bye.
Okay,
everyone.
bye.